And welcome. My name is Cindy Heitzman. I'm the Executive Director for the California Preservation Foundation. We thank you for joining us today. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure the protection of historic resources in California. We want to thank you for joining the third session of the quarterly SHPO series for the 2015-2016 year of programs. This program is made possible by the coordination and planning of the State Office of Historic Preservation staff and the California Preservation Foundation. It is being offered free to all members of the general public interested in historic preservation issues in California. Before beginning, I would like to encourage you to become a member of the California Preservation Foundation. For as little as $40, you will have discounted access to over 20 webinar programs annually, upcoming members-only advocacy forums, a dozen workshops held at historic locations across the state, our 2017 conference in Pasadena, and our annual Preservation Design Awards that will be held this year at the Arboretum, Christ Cathedral in Garden Grove. Information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour total, and we will close with a short question and answer period. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen, and if you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box, and we will hold the question until it can be addressed later by a speaker. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation. This will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. And if for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. So we're going to begin our program, and I would like to start by introducing our speakers, Shannon Lochner and Ili Labako with the California Office of Historic Preservation.
Thank you, Cindy. Hi, this is Shannon Lochner. I'm a historian with the local government unit at the California Office of Historic Preservation. I've been with the office now for approximately 10 years. And before I turn things over to Ili to introduce herself, I'd like to thank CPF for partnering with us on these very important free webinars. And I'd also like to take a second to say thank you to our participants. We were excited to see that we have a few people from out of state joining us. We certainly hope that this is going to be very California, centered, so we certainly hope that we're able to present some information that you find useful. I'd like to say thank you to some of our CLG partners we have out there, and I'm excited to see even an old grad school friend on the list of participants. So I'll now introduce Ili, or allow her to introduce herself, and we'll get started.
Good evening, folks out there. My name is Ili, and I am actually a retired planner. I worked for the last 19 years in 2 small local governments. The last 15 years I worked for the city of Monrovia as a planner, and one of my primary functions was the historic preservation program in that city. I also want to thank the state office for inviting me up here. They've become very good friends over the last 25 years. I've been able to use their resources for schooling and personal issues, and then also on my job. So always count on them for giving them a call. They're a great resource. And also thank you very much to the California Preservation Foundation for joining us and hosting this event. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions and get some good information out to everybody. So thank you for being out there.
And away we go. So as you can see, the title of our presentation today is Don't Forget the Carrots, Incentives for Preserving Your Community's Past. And we think that it's really important as preservation professionals to keep in mind that bringing people to the table in a positive way is very important. So we're going to kind of move through those possibilities today. I'm the Mills Act coordinator for the state of California, and as a result, I have the opportunity to kind of work with a lot of local incentive programs and spend my time kind of focusing on that. And so I've been doing a lot of presenting on the Mills Act, and one of the things that a quote that I found from the City of Los Angeles's webpage that I love to start out with and share is, "Successful historic preservation programs make available positive incentives, providing property owners financial and technical tools that help give new life to historic properties." And I just really do think that it's important to get started on that positive note. So preservation incentives, as we all know, exist at all levels of government, both federal, state, and local. They can be financial and technical in nature, as we just saw in Los Angeles's great quote, and they're a positive way to encourage the rehabilitation and retention of a community's really important resources. Some examples of financial incentives that I'm sure you're all familiar with are, of course, the Federal Historic Tax Program, the Mills Act, the state-enabled legislation that allows a local government to carry out its incentive program, and things like local loan and grant programs. And so we'll talk through kind of each of these things as we move forward. Some examples of technical incentives are the California Historic Building Code, local code and zoning variances, which are frequently used and Illy will be speaking to at the end, and things like a streamlined process. So our plan for today is for me to present this is Shannon again, sorry, we need to be clear about that since we're not on webcam. I'll be presenting some program information for each of these, and then Illy's going to be speaking to each of the incentives from the planner's perspective. And I should take the time to say thank you to her, because we really do appreciate having that perspective of a person who's actually administered these programs at the local level. So starting off with the federal incentives, the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentive Program is often referred to as the Federal Tax Credit Program. The current initiatives were put into act with the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It definitely encourages private sector investment in rehabilitation and adaptive reuse. And we've found that, or we have learned, that it creates jobs and is one of the nation's most successful community revitalization programs. More information can be found from the National Park Service, but as I'm sure you are all aware, it is an NPS program that is administered in partnership with the SHPO's office. And this is a good time for me to plug, in July of this year, Tim Brandt, our senior restoration architect from California Office of Historic Preservation, will be doing an hour-long presentation just on the tax credit program. So we won't be going into a ton of detail today, just kind of briefly touching on it as one of our very important incentives. One of the things that I think often gets overlooked is this concept of the 10% tax credit. Now, the 10% credit is available for buildings that are not historic buildings, but were placed into service before 1936. One of the caveats is that these properties must not be used for residential use, and keep in mind there's no formal review process for the 10% credit. The 20% credit is what we're all much more familiar with, and requires that a property be considered a certified historic structure by National Park Service. Of course, what that means is either a property that's eligible for or listed in the National Register, or is a contributor to a listed district, or is a contributor to a certified local district. Rehabilitation work must, of course, meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. For more information about the tax credit program, feel free to visit one of these resources that I have here. Tim Brandt in our office is an excellent resource, of course. So you're probably wondering, this is a webinar about incentives for local governments. Why am I talking about the federal tax credit program when that's really an owner applicant driven incentive? And one of the things that our office, and particularly our local government unit, would like you to keep in mind is that there is a way for you as local governments to assist your property owners through this process. And a great way to do that is actually by funding or assisting in the process of having a local district designated, thereby making it easier for your property owners to take advantage of the credit. And this is a great time to kind of note for all of our CLGs out there that one of those possible options for a CLG, a certified local government grant, would be the designation or the National Register nomination for one of your districts. Another thing that, as the Mills Act coordinator, one of the great things that I have heard planners do is, even if a property may not rise to the level of being eligible for or listed in the National Register, if something is locally designated and significant and say maybe eligible for the Mills Act, working with the developer or the property owner to keep in mind that they can use that 10% credit is another great way that you can take advantage or help your applicants take advantage of the federal tax credit program. So we're going to move on to state-enabled incentives, and this is where Illy is going to get a lot more active in the conversation. The first, of course, is the California Historic Building Code. We're not the experts here. This isn't a program that we administer. It is our restoration architects that would be the most involved or knowledgeable about this, but it is just important to keep in mind that this is a fabulous technical incentive that you as local governments can offer to your property owners. The building code is intended to save California's architectural heritage by recognizing the unique construction issues with maintaining and adaptively reusing historic buildings. And it provides alternatives for repairs and additions for properties that meet the definition of a qualified historical building or structure.
This is Illy speaking. In my experience working with the State Historic Building Code, the community where I retired from, Monrovia, along with a lot of other communities in California, have adopted the State Historic Building Code as one of their historic preservation incentives. And what I would do whenever I dealt with one of my historic properties that was doing any kind of repair work, because as planners we're not experts in the building field, I always referred them to our building division manager, who they would work directly with to see if the project that they were working on could qualify for some of the deviations that the Historic Building Code offers. So that's how, most planners are going to be dealing in that respect because, again, the experts are your building officials.
That's great perspective. Thank you, Illy. So the slide that's been up is what qualifies for the California Historical Building Code, and you'll see I'm a little bit of a definition junkie, particularly working in this field where we have so many different definitions for things, whether it's something that's eligible for the California Register versus a historic property under Section 106. We throw out the term historic resource, but where do you find that in code anywhere? So I always like to clearly define what properties are eligible for what programs. And under the building code, a qualified historical building or structure is essentially a property that's listed in the National Register, the California Register, any state program. So that could be state landmark, state point of historical interest, or of course a local register. And you'll kind of see this flashing by here in just a minute when we start talking about the Mills Act. There are some similarities, but strangely different terms are used for what qualifies. So we are moving on to the Mills Act now, and I'm sorry if this program or presentation is a little bit Mills Act heavy. It's just that in doing research for this presentation, we really found not only is this the area that both Illy and I are the most knowledgeable about, but it's also, it seems to be the most widely used incentive in the state. So if we hope we touch on the important points. If you have additional questions, that would be wonderful. We hope we have a fruitful discussion at the end. And if it's too Mills Act heavy, we apologize. So what is the Mills Act? It's a state-enabled local property tax incentive that is meant to encourage the restoration or rehabilitation of privately owned historic resources or properties. The program is designed and administered by a local government with help from the assessor, and there is no state oversight. So that may seem confusing in that we consider this kind of a state-enabled incentive, and it's categorized that way in this presentation, but it really truly is a locally driven incentive. A local government with a Mills Act program can enter into a contract with a property owner to restore, rehabilitate, or maintain their historically significant property in exchange for some property tax savings. So where is the Mills Act? I think some of you have probably heard me say this several times in presentations over the years, but it never ceases to amaze me that there are planners, program administrators out there that have a Mills Act program and they really don't even know where the state legislation is, where the code is. So I always include this information. The law that's known as the Mills Act is actually found in the California Government Code in Article 12, Sections 5280 through 5290. And as I mentioned, it's very simply state enabling legislation that creates the framework through which a local government can adopt their program. All of the authority for the program is given to the local governments. A little bit of Mills Act history. The act was authored in 1972 by Southern California State Senator James Mills in response to the plight of the situation at the Hotel del Coronado, where this kind of beautiful, internationally recognized property was really in jeopardy of potentially being demolished because the property owner was under a lot of pressure because of property taxes to build out his land to its highest value. Senator Mills was troubled by this. The property owner was troubled by this. He did not want, he wanted to continue operating his beautiful resource as is. And so with the help of some others, Senator Mills authored the Mills Act and modeled it very closely on what we know as the Williamson Act. In 1985, another major change occurred. There were some amendments in between 1972 and 1985, but in 1985, a major amendment was passed that reduced the terms of the contract significantly. Originally, a contract under the Mills Act was for a minimum of 20 years, which was very unpopular, and as a result, the program wasn't used as actively. So the period was reduced to 10 years. And at the same time, the obligation to have your property open to the public 1 day a year was removed, and the penalty for cancellation was reduced from 50% of fair market value down to its current 12.5%. And then most recently in 2012, the act was amended, and at that point, after our financial crash in California, I'm sure some of you or most of you may be familiar with this, there was a push to have kind of any local revenue loss really transparent, and one of the means for doing that with the Mills Act, because there is some property tax savings, was to require inspections both before a contract is let and then again every 5 years thereafter. And local governments are getting very creative with their low staffing numbers on how they're achieving this requirement. So a little bit about, from the local government level, how you implement a program. Again, this is a very flexible, very loose law. Local governments have the ability to either go through the formal ordinance process to adopt their program or amend their historic preservation ordinance by including the Mills Act, or they can adopt by simple resolution. Of course, from our perspective, if you do go the resolution route, we certainly recommend that you have some solid administrative guidelines that are available to both, potential participants and staff as staff turns over, so that you really know you have a clear process for administering your program and everybody involved knows what to expect. The beautiful thing about the Mills Act is that local governments have the option, the choice to target types of properties that they wish to. You could choose your commercial facades, down your main street. You could limit to single family. It's really what fits your community. And local governments also can choose their method of inspection post 2012. I see we've got Robert Chattel on the line, and he's involved in the inspections for the city of Los Angeles, which are very thorough, very rigorous. There are other places it's as simple as self-reporting. They send out a survey annually and say, tell us what you've done this year, or tell us what you've done over the last 5 years to maintain your qualified historical property. So what qualifies here? It's qualified historical property is the technical term in this case, but yet again, it's properties that are eligible for or listed in the National Register of Historic Places, the California Register, California Landmarks, Points of Interest, or locally designated properties. In working with programs, I do see most often that local governments choose to limit eligibility for the Mills Act program to things that are locally designated, but that's not universally true. So the Mills Act math, this is kind of, we're not the mathematicians, we're not the assessors here, but this is just kind of a brief overview. In order for property owners to see the best savings by, committing to restrict their property and maintain it in a certain way, what they do, the assessor annually is supposed to assess their property at both the factor base year value, which those of us in California really refer to as the Prop 13 value, current fair market value, oops, my slides have gotten a little messed up here, which is, the listing price if you were to sell it today. And then, of course, the Mills Act or restricted value, which is based on current rent versus, minus some loss, and then a Board of Equalization factor built in there. But annually, the property owner should see the lowest of those three.
This is Ilya. I want to interject something here. Every year, our city would receive a document from the assessor's office that was also sent to the property owner. Excuse me. And as Shannon indicated, we would see a figure that was, here's what the market value of the home is now. Here is the Prop 13 value, as we refer to, and here's the Mills Act value. So every year we were able to see how each property was benefiting, or in some cases not benefiting, depending on how long they have owned their home. So we, as a city, did get notification from the assessor every year of the values of the homes.
At this point, I think that we're beginning to move towards local incentives, but I would really love to hear, this is a great place for Illy to interject, if you will, just a little bit more too about the administration of the program. She comes from a small to middle-sized local government in Southern California, and just a little bit about staff time and what it takes to administer a Mills Act program, because I know that that can be cumbersome and in fact is often a deterrent for people for adopting a Mills Act program.
Yes, the city, for those of you who don't know, the city of Monrovia, where I spent my last 15 years, is a community of about 3,600 people. 36,000 people, and we are located about 15 miles east of Pasadena. And the Mills Act was very popular in our city. It was one of the biggest incentives to draw people to come forward and landmark their homes. And of course, they had to be designated as a landmark, so they had to fall under one of the 7 different criteria. You have to become a landmark there. For a small city, we had, at the time that I retired in December, we had 136 landmarks, of which 125 had Mills Act contracts. And one of the conditions for a Mills Act contract is we had a form called a Standards and Conditions form, where every home had some kind of a project or some kind of something that they had to complete within at least the first 10 years of their contract. Everything that was on that contract, we had to then, of course, monitor. So we had a reporting system where we wanted to have an update presented to us with every 2 years, at least for the first 10 years of the contract. And as the only planner that was in charge of that, it can become cumbersome. It's just a matter of really finding a system that works for you. I maintained a large spreadsheet that had all of the Mills Act contracts, addresses, contact information, and upon the nearing of their 2-year anniversary, I would contact and remind them to please send me their update. And again, I made it as simple as possible for them. It could be simply an email telling me, this is the things that we have done to our property. Some people were a little bit more elaborate, which we greatly appreciated. They would send us before and after pictures of restoration projects that were part of their conditions of approval. So it's just a matter of finding a system that works for you with your staffing. We had a staffing of only 3 planners in our office, yet we were able to, I think we were able to very effectively run a very good program for a small city. So just a little background information about
And we agree, which is why we've asked Illy to participate in this. So, and at this point, I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to Illy for a bit because, as I mentioned before, at OHP, we don't actively administer any local incentives, and so we felt like it was really critical that we have that planner's perspective to discuss these things. So Ellie's going to take the wheel for a bit.
All right, here we go.
I think here you have to actually click on the, yeah.
Okay, so some of these incentives can or cannot be adopted by your city. One of them is adaptive reuse. I never have personally worked with adaptive reuse, but basically it's a way to allow a property to be used for a use other than that what's originally designed for. So what we have done, both Shannon and I, we've looked up some communities that may have some of these incentives so that if it's something that you think your community may be interested in, you can go and look at their municipal code, see how it's written up. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. If the verbiage is out there for you, that it's a matter of looking at it and modifying it to what works for you. So that I found that both the City of Long Beach and the City of Los Angeles have an adaptive reuse program. So you can look those up. They would require going through a conditional use permit process, but again, check it out. Next incentive that we're looking at, setback flexibility. I actually did work with a setback flexibility. Those of us that are planners know that our municipal code requires additions, for example, to be set back at least, say 5 feet from a side property line. A lot of our older homes, at least in the city where I worked, maybe had a 3 or 4 foot setback. So if a historic property owner wanted to do an addition to the back of their house, for example, and they wanted to keep it in line with the existing 3 foot setback, we would have the flexibility to go through what some cities called a minor variance process, and we would have findings in our municipal code that would give us the findings to do so because they are a historic landmark. Again, if you implement something like a setback flexibility, you could restrict it just to single family houses. You could do single family and multiple family houses. You can include even up to commercial structures. You are the ones that can tailor it to your community. Additionally, you may want to restrict it to only additions that are to the back of the house, maybe to the back of the side of the structure. Some people may want to completely eliminate the possibility of any kind of setback flexibility if it's on the front. Again, tailor it to your needs. The City of Monrovia has setback flexibility in their ordinance. City of Covina, City of Long Beach, and the City of San Clemente. Those are some cities that you can look at their ordinances. Next one is the relief from non-conforming parking requirements. And here's where you're not going to require a historic resource to be upgraded to the current parking requirements when they have an addition or a change of use. I did work with this quite a bit. We have in Monrovia, as most communities, some of our older homes all have the one-car garage. And you may have a trigger point that says, okay, once you add 50 square feet to your house, you now have to upgrade to an enclosed 2-car garage. Sometimes that just doesn't work with a historic property, just the way the property is configured, laid out on there. So we had in our ordinance in Monrovia the ability to not have them upgrade to the 2-car garage when they were doing a project that would normally cause them, or for other people that were not historic resources, to make them go up to the 2-car garage. Again, you can restrict this to just your single family homes, multiple family homes, or you could completely exclude commercial structures. Some cities, when they, the change in use, you would have to upgrade. Maybe being a historic resource, you could stay away from that. Some of the cities that had that non-conforming parking, the relief would be, of course, I mentioned Monrovia. San Clemente has it in their ordinance, Covina, Long Beach, and Pasadena. So please look at what they have and see if it might be something that you can model for your community. Fee waivers, fee reductions. I did work with this also, and historic resources in Monrovia, we would have a reduction if in our situation, whatever the normal building permit cost would be to do any kind of repair or maintenance on the historic resource, the building permit cost would be reduced by 40%. The city of Covina has it in their ordinance, and they offer a 30% reduction. There may be some cities out there that would completely waive the building permit fee, but that would be something that, of course, would be dependent on the funding sources in your community. A recognition program. In Monrovia, we had a recognition program that basically would entitle the historic property owner to put a plaque. Of course, it was actually one of our conditions that they had to, within 2 years of becoming a landmark, put a plaque on their home. Everybody loved to do this. We actually had some people that would come in and say, I want to be a landmark because I want to put a plaque on my house. So different cities can adopt this in a different way. If you have the monies to help fund, half of it or all of it, that would be something you would have to look at. In our community, our nonprofit historic preservation group would help fund some of the fees. They have a grant program that they would help fund some of them. So that would be something to look at. And Pomona is another city besides Monrovia that has a recognition program for their historic landmarks.
I know that the city of Monterey also has a very active plaque program, and I also realize that over the years some of us have kind of giggled and snickered at plaques, but we have found in kind of years of working with local governments and property owners, they love their plaques, and it really is that pride of ownership really does bring people to the preservation table.
It also helps if you have a local nonprofit that might have either walking tour or a auto tour, that they easily see the buildings that are a part of their tour by seeing their plaque. Okay, I'm going to turn this one over to Shannon here because I personally have never dealt with preservation easements.
Well, and I actually haven't worked with them either, but in doing some research for this presentation, it does seem like there's quite a bit of a number of local governments out there that have either easements or oftentimes called covenants, which as far as the legal difference between the two, I'm not entirely certain. In fact, we have some staff working on getting to the bottom of that right now. But this is something that is frequently used. The Historic Preservation Grant Fund is something that I really like to highlight. I work closely with the City of Riverside. I recognize that this is sadly pie in the sky for a lot of cities. This is actually a brick and mortar grant program that Riverside was lucky enough to implement. They have this preservation fund. Eligible properties, designated properties, can apply annually, and over the last couple of years they've granted something like $400,000 to projects. And again, they use this along with the rehabilitation restoration. Once the project is complete, a sign is placed in the front. Now, it's not a plaque that's affixed, and it is, I believe, the property owner's choice, but they advertise, if you will, to the community that they have taken advantage of and been awarded this preservation fund. And as a result, the City of Riverside's preservation program is actually finding that this is working towards their outreach. Sorry, we're hearing some ticking here, trying to figure out where that was coming from. It was a little bit distracting. So they have community members that are coming to the table and are actually interested in historic preservation because they see the signs that are a result of this preservation grant fund. The City of Sacramento, I believe, also has a small grant. It's not renewed annually, but there periodically are some funds available. So if any of you have funding available, it's a wonderful, wonderful incentive. That's a good question. We see that a question came in about how do local governments fund these grant funds. That it's rare to get this funding. I believe the situation in Riverside is that it may have been mitigation that the local government then was authorized to set aside, and I don't know if it is something that maybe some general funds have also been applied. I can speak with Riverside, or I would recommend that you actually, speak to them directly for the specifics. But I do think that's the largest challenge. Even, here at the Office of Historic Preservation, we struggle with, having an option. Brick and mortar grant funding for local governments is kind of one of the hardest pieces. Transfer of development rights is something that I saw a lot about in preparing for this. Of course, this is going to be something that's more applicable in the urban areas. I know that the city of San Francisco uses this, but the concept is really that a property owner that chooses to kind of retain their historic property has the right then to syndicate or sell their development rights if they were to, demolish and build to its highest potential. The historic property, they're able to then pass that on to somebody else that can take advantage of it. Of course, we're all familiar with this from, some of the kind of fundamental historic preservation background from New York City and Penn Central. But, this is something that does seem to be, as California is experiencing a great deal of development pressure, some of these larger cities that are really struggling with housing are starting to use this, offer this again. I don't know where that's coming from.
Somebody might have their mic on.
Okay, sorry, we're hearing a lot.
Yeah, this is Cindy. If I could ask that, make sure that everyone has their phone muted. It is distracting to hear the noise in the background. Carry on.
Okay, and another thing that we've got, actually the city of San Francisco definitely uses the historic sign exemption. So the idea would be that in a designated area, district, or historic property, there are kind of some exemptions from height limits for historic signs that are a significant or contributing feature to a commercial property.
The city of Pasadena, so covering the southern section of California, they also have a historic sign exemption.
You can't tell at all, can you, that Shannon's from Northern California and Ellie's from Southern California, as our examples kind of indicate. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up was the streamlined project review for designated properties. This is also something just recently at the California Preservation Foundation conference. We had a local government forum that we do annually. We encourage all of our CLGs to come and really just have an active discussion about what's going on in your communities. And one of the questions I posed was really in preparation for this, hoping to learn a little bit more about the creative incentives that were out there. And one of the planners from the city of San Francisco indicated that they had recently done some research and found that it's those technical incentives in the large urban areas that are bringing property owners to the table. And one for the city that is very effective was a streamlined project review. So knowing that your historic property, that you're dealing with a designated property, and then having a more expeditious and clear path through the project review process was something that was very useful. Also, I'll just say, and this is something that I hope that we can chat about in a bit, because it looks like we're going to have quite a bit of time for question and answer, is another thing we threw out in preparation for this webinar, questions to our certified local government listserv and to the National Alliance of Historic Preservation Commissions. Tell us about the incentives that you have out there, what's working well, what's not. And what we heard a lot is that we offer these incentives, but people aren't taking advantage of them. And so, my question to you would be, A, what do you offer? And B, how are you letting your property owners know what's available to them? Because it is such a critical way to bring people kind of to the preservation table at the local level. And so, it's a great opportunity for us to have a conversation about what's working well in some of your communities, and if it's not, what can we do better to notify people that these great incentives are out there. The reason that we chose at OHP to have Illy speak, and I will, since we have so much time, if you don't mind,
Yes.
I'll put you on the spot and throw it to you. The city of Monrovia has a program that is completely voluntary. Of course, that's an issue that we deal with in local preservation all the time, is owner designate or owner objection versus owner consent, and who controls that. In the city of Monrovia, it's the property owner that has 100% control, and yet they have a strong preservation ethic and they have a really active program, and it's largely driven by the incentive. So I'm going to give Illy a few minutes to talk about how that worked, and then we'll throw it to you guys for questions.
Yes, for us, the Mills Act by far was our biggest incentive. As a city, we did not have to advertise it. Our realtors were very familiar with it. Excuse me. We also have a very active nonprofit group in town called the Monrovia Historic Preservation Group. They are strong in marketing it also. So it was not ever an issue for us to get the information out there about the Mills Act. Everybody wanted to come in. There's a lot of pride of ownership in that community for the historic property owners. And they were all thrilled to know, those that, to go through with landmarking and getting a Mills Act contract, that, well, we also had these other incentives. We had, if you wanted to do an addition, we had setback flexibility. If you needed to get a permit, guess what? Now it's going to be reduced. So these were other added incentives that the community had. One other thing, too, that I want to just jot real briefly is, we have and I say we because I consider it my home, even though I'm not there anymore. We had a bed and breakfast ordinance. Right now, it may not be such a popular thing because you've got so many of the
Airbnb.
the vacation rental situation, but there is a bed and breakfast ordinance in the books of Monrovia, and for a historic resource, historic landmark, if you wanted to also do a bed and breakfast, we had another incentive there, that the conditions that we normally applied to a regular bed and breakfast for a historic resource were much more lenient. We allowed more of the rooms to be rented out. There were just some more leniencies, still going through a conditional use permit process, but that was one other benefit that we had there. But the Mills Act, again, was never a difficult one for us to have to market. And for a community, it only has 36,000 people. When you've got 125 Mills Act contracts, that's a pretty good number.
Significant. And I see we have a question here with regard to the Mills Act from Cristobal, asking if the Mills Act is effective in communities where property values are low. And the short answer is not as much. But the better answer is really that yes, it is still effective in that, we have kind of anecdotally found over the years that in areas where historic properties, or qualified historical properties in this case for the Mills Act, have been retained, property values stay higher, and there's the added benefit that the assessor then calculates all three of those, whether it's the fair market value, the Prop 13 value, or the Mills Act value. The lowest of those three is how the property is assessed each year. And so there is still opportunity for savings, even if the Mills Act may not be the lowest of the three values each year.
We in Monrovia actually had, I believe it was 6 properties that were no longer benefiting from the Mills Act reduction rate. And these were all property owners who had owned their homes for 20, 25 years. But for the several years that they had the contract, they were able to benefit significantly from it. We're looking at the questions here.
And this is a question actually I'm going to throw to Cindy Heitzman. At this point, I think we are really ready for the next 15 minutes or however many questions we have to turn it over to just Q&A and discussion. I don't know, is that something you facilitate and you read the questions to us, or we're having a hard time kind of seeing all of the questions in our little chat box, so we just want to make sure that we're not missing any?
Sure. Well, let me open it up, and I'm happy to field the question. So I just enlarged the chat box. I don't know if you could see it any more.
It makes a big difference. Thank you.
You bet.
So the question about easements, the way I understand it, and again, this is not a program that we administer, this is coming from Sandra. And again, local governments may choose to go about this differently, but it's offering the easement or the kind of covenant. I believe they have to be National Register eligible properties or listed properties, but then you can donate the easement for the maintenance in perpetuity of your property, and as a result, there's tax savings, income tax savings, just as there would be, say, for an environmental easement that is put on your property because you have habitat for a garter snake or something along those lines. Or you can, have an easement, a conservation easement on your property so that it's retained as, public land or undeveloped land. There is a tax write-off for that. I would recommend that you go to the IRS code to find the specifics. This isn't really my area of expertise. It's just one of the things that I saw coming up pretty frequently. I have worked briefly with some covenants in the city of Eureka that were the result of a Section 106 consultation. So I know that there's the trade-off is the maintenance, the restoration of your historic property in exchange, and you donate that easement to, say, a nonprofit or a local government that's able to and willing to hold that easement or covenant, and then there is some tax savings for the property owner that donates the easement or covenant.
There's a question from Stephen regarding, under the Mills Act, what type of limitations are there on structural changes? Keep in mind that the Mills Act can be adopted with any kind of restrictions that the community wishes to. There is the basic law, which you cannot weaken the state legislation, but each community can put their limitations. As far as structural changes, I personally dealt with several additions to our Mills Act properties, and they are required to follow the Secretary of Interior standards for additions, restoration. But keep in mind too that some of the other limitations that you can put on, for those of you out there that do not have a Mills Act, is you can limit the number of contracts that you process each year. You can limit the assessed value of the properties that could come forward with an application. There's, you could restrict it just to your single-family homes, maybe just to residential, maybe exclude commercial structures. So there's a lot of communities out there that have a Mills Act contract. As a matter of fact, the state office here has a list of all the communities that have Mills Act contracts. So you can look at what communities that maybe are near you that you can contact or look at their ordinances and see how they have adopted their Mills Act.
With regard to the structural changes, though, I think Illy hit on the important part is that it's locally administered, and so the concept is really that, if it's a local government that has a robust or kind of a well-defined historic preservation program with a historic, with an ordinance, a preservation ordinance, that property would be, locally designated for the most part, not universally, but for the most part, and would then go through your local historic preservation process, probably resulting in a certificate of appropriateness. Thereby, any changes made to the property would most likely meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, should meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And it would go through that local process as any locally designated property would. The difference being that that property owner with the Mills Act contract is also seeing some financial incentive or benefit for having designated their property.
Yes, we would always take them through a certificate of appropriateness process, and in our situation, and in looking at other cities, a very similar process. You would take them first to your Historic Preservation Commission, and in most cases, in our city it was at least, that they were the deciding factor. It did not have to go on to either a planning commission or a city council.
Well, we don't see any other questions coming in. Are there more out there?
Yeah. Well, if you have no other questions, speaking to the audience, then I would like to thank our speakers, Shannon Lochner and Nili Labaco, for joining us today. And again, thank the staff of the Office of Historic Preservation for partnering with CPF and providing these free webinars. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today. There is an evaluation that is appearing on your screen. And I would like to invite you to participate in this survey. We'd appreciate any feedback on this webinar and recommendations for future topics. Your recommendations are important, and this is how we plan our programs for the upcoming year. So it's the timing is right, and we hope you'll participate. And again, would encourage each of you who are not members of CPF to join. There are a number of benefits for members, including complimentary webinars, depending on the level and the type of membership. For more information about our upcoming webinars, workshops, and other programs, please visit our website at http://news.californiapreservation.org/events. Sorry, that's a mouthful. So thanks to all of you, and I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.